also pass this on to other people. So the background to choosing this particular topic was that I had a number of inquiries during the work planning season about how to conduct competency gap analysis, and a number of people were sort of talking to me about that, and I thought it would be a great topic to share because we've been doing a fair bit of work in this particular project on this. On the call, I would like to acknowledge that we've got a number of GHSC folk from different countries and headquarters. We've got some USAID colleagues, you're also very welcome, and we also have some consultants who are from our GHSC-PSM consulting bench, and we'd like to welcome you as well. The overall talk will be around about 50 minutes. During our time, please, in the chat, if you have any particular questions, please let us know. For those on the call who haven't got access to the computer, I will stop on a couple of occasions and invite you to ask questions audibly. If you can't hear at this time, you need to check your settings because I've checked mine and people can hear me. So this is how we're going to go through things today. I'm going to set the scene by having a look at supply chain management competencies as the basis for thinking about competency or gap analysis. There's some skills that people need to be able to do this properly, and those are professional reflection and then also planning professional development, which I want to talk to you about. And then I want to introduce to you four different tools or three different tools, four different sets of resources that are available for you to access and to apply in your country contexts. I want to give you a quick overview of how we've been applying these tools in 3 country case studies in Nigeria, Angola, and Malawi. And welcome to those on the call from those 3 countries. And also want to just finish off by summarizing how you can be applying these tools in your country and some country application approaches and available resources for that purpose. So this is what we're going to be doing together. As I say, as we move along, if you've got any questions or points of clarification, please type those in the chat. So you'll be all familiar with this particular slide. It's a slide that is a lovely picture of supply chain, health supply chain cycle. All of the components are there that we need to have a functioning health supply chain, from product selection, quantification, inventory management, to serving customers. And the center of that particular diagram talks about LMIS, pipeline monitoring, staffing, budgeting, supervision. We know supply chains are complex, but to really break it down so that we understand what are the actual skills, attitudes, and competencies that staff need to be able to run supply chains depending on their role, we need to really use a competency framework for that purpose. And those of you who have been on my previous webinars will note I often refer back to this particular tool, which is the People That Deliver Competency Framework for Health Supply Chain Management. And this particular competency framework, you'll see there are 6 circles here. These are 6 different domains or groups of competencies. And if you've not had a look at this tool, there's a hot link here for when you get the slide deck. You can take a look. But basically, it breaks down all of the components of supply chain management into bite-sized pieces called behaviors that people should be able to observe. And so this is important when we think about gap analysis. So if you have not come across a competency framework before, we talk about domains as groups of competencies that have a similar function. And for this purpose, there are 6 in the People That Deliver framework. Under these large areas, we have smaller areas of competency areas, and then we actually have behaviors, which are things that you will observe people to be able to do in the workplace. So the competency is the overarching capacity skills of a person to perform in an area, whereas the behavioral competencies is what you can see people actually doing in the workplace. Now, this next slide is a little bit detailed, and I just want to show you briefly, but refer to it for you to go and have a look as a reference. And this says that there are 4 technical domains in the competency framework, and just outlines these higher level particular competency areas. So for example, if you're talking about storage and distribution, is undertake storage, warehousing and inventory, supply commodities to facilities, etc. But then the next step down in the framework is the behaviours, and really lists out the step-by-step behaviours that people would need to show in the workplace in order for that to be undertaken. Then the next slide is looking at the management domains, which is resource management, professional and personal management. Now, in a supply chain, all of these competencies need to be present for you to have a good functioning supply chain. It's up to your particular country context and your supply chain as to who is the staff members that are doing the activities and what role they have. And so what I'm not going to be talking about today is specific roles. I'm going to give you an approach. If you've come online, welcome. I'd encourage you to make sure you're muted, and you're welcome. Now, let's just see if we can track that person and mute them. It's lovely having the power of muting. So, so what I've tried to do just now is just to give you an overview to say competency. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, while we're interrupted, can you email out the slide deck, please, for those for whom the web is not working?
Yeah, I just did that. If you responded to the email, if you accepted the invitation, I've sent it out. And did you just check your email? Is it there?
It's not there.
Okay, let me just quickly resend to everybody. So just one moment while we do that.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Appreciate if you can't see the slides. So thank you, everyone. Just bear with me.
It might just be a problem with your email. I received it. This is Annika.
So I've just resent it out. I'll get spam in return for sending out too many emails, but I've done my best just now. And Annika, if you could just forward a copy from your email to Bridget, just as a double check, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Will do.
Okay, so great. So let's go back to where we were here. And I was simply pointing out that understanding competencies is the basis for doing competency gap analysis. And so you need to have a look at that particular framework in order to really understand. If you have any questions about competency frameworks, we're not going to go into too much detail about that just now, but if you have anything you want to put in the chat about competency frameworks, let me know. Now, there are two ways to approach a competency gap analysis. One of those is doing an employee self-assessment, either individual employees or a cohort. And this is where employees rate their own ability against a reference standard. And the second is an employee proficiency test. So you would give some type of exam or test to determine if particular employees meet the technical the technical competencies of the particular area that you're working in. Now, those tests could be a mini exam, they could be putting together a portfolio of evidence, there could be all sorts of ways of doing that. But for an employee self-assessment, the limitations are that you need to be able to do professional self-reflection honestly and give an objective opinion, and people need to know that the information they are providing is going to be used wisely and well. With regard to proficiency testing, whatever type of test you conduct is also has limitations by the environment the test is given in, the style or type of the test. We all do things in different ways, and we prefer different testing to another. Some people are very bad at multiple choice tests, for example, and some people can't write essays. So there's also the personal factor, which means people may have fatigue or a different approach to exams. So there's no perfect model to do competency gap analysis. But today I want to talk about two different approaches that you may consider. One is employee self-assessment of individuals or cohorts, and the other one is proficiency testing, which also involves individual or cohorts. But before I give some examples of that, I want to talk to you about a couple of key concepts that not only do you need to understand as someone looking to conduct these activities, but you also need to make sure that the people you're working with understand this. When I was lecturing at university on professional behaviour in health, one of the things we discussed was this competence of professional self-reflection, the ability of being able to objectively stand outside yourself and look back in and critically ask yourself, what are you doing well? What do I need to improve? And how good am I really? And to do that in an honest way is not something that everyone has experienced. And in different cultures, that may be even less likely that people will have that competence. But in our experience in Malawi, Nigeria, and Angola, it's quite possible to create the environment to make that happen. But I just want to emphasize that for this concept of employee self-assessment to work, the employees have to be able to use the professional skill of self-reflection. The other aspect that I want to talk about is personal learning plan. The reason I want to bring this up is competency gap analysis you can actually do on yourself. And if you are a professional in public health or a professional in supply chain or a professional in anything, you should be actively doing this yourself. And the output of doing a gap analysis is you understand your knowledge and competency gaps, but you need to do something next, and that is do a personal learning plan. Again, this is just to close the loop on why you do an analysis and what you can do with that, and I will also explain that in the case studies. But the concept of professional reflection and the concept of developing a personal learning plan are two important competencies to consider. So what I would like to do now is we've started off thinking about competency frameworks as the basis for gap analysis. I've noted a couple of important things to consider, particularly professional self-reflection. And just a reminder, we've said that there are two different types of tools, employee self-assessment and proficiency testing. What I'd like to do now is give you an overview of what's available in the supply chain marketplace at the moment in relation to these tools. Firstly, I'd like to tell you about two employee self-assessment tools. The first one is from Pamela Steele Associates. It's a competency self-assessment tool that's available online for a fee of between 80 and 100 US dollars, depending on your cohort. You can do this individually, or you can organize to have a cohort subscription. Basically, it measures technical management and leadership competencies across the whole people that deliver competency framework that I've just mentioned to you earlier. And it consists of short competency statements that you're asked to rate your abilities using a particular scale. So for example, if you think about supply chain management, let's think about storage, and then one of the competencies would be about, are you able to organize a rotating stock take of all your stock? And you need to, the language that's chosen is so that you can think about the statement according to your personal abilities and rate yourself on a 7-point scale. So there are 230 odd of these statements covering 20 competency areas, and there are 25 leadership competencies. And it takes about 30 minutes to 40 minutes to complete, and it's available in English, French, Spanish, and Aramaic. Sorry, excuse me, Arabic. Aramaic as an ancient language is probably not, so let's go with Arabic. The point here is that I've done this myself, this particular test. It does take about that 30 minutes. You have to answer each of those questions. And the logic behind it is there's a lot of psychology behind self-assessment testing. And the company, Pamela Steele Associates, has outsourced to a particular company that is a British expert company in doing online self-assessment tools. And so there is built in there different questions that statistically can tell the viewer of the results whether people are perhaps being a bit biased in their answers compared to the average, whether they're those types of things. And the wording and how things are put together has been carefully considered to limit any mistakes. So this is this particular test that is available. Now it's available online. Everything's uploaded, ready to go. You can actually go to this website and there is a video that's a 10-minute video that you can watch that gives you an overview and an understanding of what the process entails. And in the link I will provide you at the conclusion of the seminar today is an example of a report, a de-identified report of a cohort of workers that we put through that assessment. So you'll be able to get an idea of what that looks like. So the end result is if you do a cohort, you get a cohort summary, and you can also get individual reports, and the individuals who fill out the survey also get individual reports. And in that individual report, they can see how they have performed against the cohort, where their strengths and weaknesses are, and also how they've performed against the international average of all the people that have taken that self-reflection quiz so far. So in short, it's a self-assessment. It uses the People That Deliver competency framework. It's about $80 and it covers all competency areas. The next approach I want to talk to you about is another employee self-reflection approach, but it's what we are using within the project. So we've applied this same principle of self-reflection and we've used the People That Deliver competency framework, and we've done our own paper-based system, and we had it translated into Portuguese, and we've used that in Angola. Another thing we've done is used job descriptions for supply chain advisors in Nigeria to create a 5-point Likert scale here, where those workers can reflect on the different statements of their work so that how well they're doing their current job description. So they can rate themselves against their current job description. And then in Malawi, what we've done is we've taken a subset of the competency framework, and then we have adapted that for particular groups. So for example, we've done a self-assessment tool for the job of a supply chain manager at the facility level, and it's just those competencies at the facility level. There are about 25. We've done one for district managers in Malawi for what are their supervisory skills that they need. So it was a subset that we focused on, and more about that shortly. So in short, using the principle of competencies, using the principle of self-reflection, you can create your own tools. And at the end of the talk, you will have a link to a Dropbox that will have examples of these tools so you can actually see. And I'll bring up a couple now actually, just to show you. So in terms of, I'd like to show you the Angola one, just briefly on screen. And for those of you who are on the call, we'll give you a link to these. And this is a very brief part of the talk. And basically, I'm just going to scroll down to the area. There's some introductory explanation. This is an earlier draft. And this is the area. So you can see that it has a competency statement. So let me show you an example. So for selecting the appropriate product, the behavioural competency is describe the broad concepts of National Medicines Policy, Essential Medicines List, Essential Equipment List, Standard Treatment Guidelines, and Dangerous Drug or DDA or Narcotics Policy. And so then the person filling this out will answer either I cannot do this at all, I could do this a little, I can do this very well, or I'm an expert, or it's not relevant to my work. And you can appreciate if you fill in answers to those statements that you can have a pretty good profile at the end about what you're strong at and what you're weak at. Another one I want to show you, which is a different approach, is this Malawi Tool. In Malawi, we looked at what were the behaviours that were expected of staff at the facility level. And this is a one-page document rather than the 20-page document for Angola. And here's an example. So the first competency here is how well do you understand and can complete each activity? Number one, how the medicine supply system works in the district. And then again, there's the same 5-point scale I mentioned before. Or how and when to contact your supervisor, or how to fill in the logistics management system report, how to fill in a stock card, how to calculate your average monthly consumption. Now, this list of behaviours we took from the job description and validated with the staff in Malawi to come up with that list. And I just wanted to show you that as an example. The Nigeria example, which is also in the Dropbox you'll get, is similar but based entirely on the job description and covers managerial responsibilities as well as supply chain competencies. So what I've tried to do in this section is to say, for employee self-assessment, which is one type of gap analysis, we could use the Pamela Steele Associates tool, and I will provide the link to that for those asking. Or you can use a self-reflection tool that you develop yourself. And there are 3 different ways we've been doing that in our project. One using the overall People That Deliver Competency framework, one using specific job descriptions, and the third looking at a subset of competencies for different people in different facility environments. And again, at this stage, I would invite you if you have any particular questions. And before I move on to the next type of tools, I'll invite those people on the call, if you have any particular clarifying questions that you would like to ask about those 2 types of employee self-assessment tools, the line is open for you to make those comments. We'll just give a minute or so in case anyone on call wants to make a call. Those of you who have access to the computer, please type your question. And for a few seconds, I'll sing for a moment. Okay, so I'll take that as being that my explanation was good, and we shall move on. So if you remember, we said that there are 2 types of ways of testing. One was a self-assessment, and the other is an employee proficiency test. Thanks, Florence, for that question. And I think that'll come out in terms of can you compare outcomes of a self-assessment tools with competencies assessment as done by a manager? And the answer is yes. Any behavior or competency that you can write out, you can ask someone to self-reflect on. Now, again, if you remember in the limitation section, you're relying on the people being honest. One thing I didn't mention is that in some environments using this approach, they will involve a supervisor, and so filling that form correctly. So for example, in Australia, we use this approach to improve the competence of pharmacists working in the hospital environment, where they will do the self-reflection against the competency framework that we've just described, and then they will sit down with their supervisor who will go over the answers that the student has or the pharmacist has put and make their own observations based on the work performance, and so have that interactive discussion together, which is another way of using that tool in a mentoring way. And I haven't focused on that today. At the moment, the PSM tools are in English and also in Portuguese. The People That Deliver framework for leaders and managers is in French as well as English and Spanish, so you could cut and paste from that document. I'd like to introduce you to the Competency Assessment Tool, CAT, from Empower School of Health. I'm sorry, this slide is a little bit smaller font, but basically, the Empower School of Health had some funding from one of the UN agencies, and were able to develop an open access competency assessment tool. But instead of just looking at self-assessment, they are looking at an employee proficiency test as well. So this is the main point of difference. So on the screen, I'm showing that I'm up to slide 18 for those following on the call. So in the competency assessment tool approach by Empower, they are looking at an overall profile of PSM candidates. Now, by PSM here, we're talking about any procurement supply management candidate. And the profile of the candidate is made up of three components. One is their education and qualifications, so their profile. The second is their work experience. And then the third is the domain competency, so how competent they are in a particular domain area. Now, this group also uses the people that deliver competency framework and has, you'll see on the screen, the 5 domains. They do not particularly focus on the management domains, but this tool focuses on the technical domains rather than leadership or management. And within those technical domains, to assess domain competency, they do two things. One, they ask people to rate themselves using a self-assessment approach, but they also give a 10-question multiple choice quiz for each of these competency areas. Now that quiz, the questions vary in complexity, and the result can give strengths and weaknesses of the candidate in terms of their strong competencies and their weaker competencies. This can also be used across a cohort. So this tool is available free of charge for individuals. So you can get as many people to log on and do it for free, and they will be sent an individual report. You can negotiate with Empower to ask to have a cohort done, and you can then pay for a cohort report that will compare individuals against the cohort and then compare your cohort against the international average. And this is what we did in Nigeria, which I'll report on shortly. And the cost for that was approximately $2,000 for 20 individuals for all their analysis, just to let you know. And it was a similar price for the Pamela Steele analysis as well, which is a proprietary product. So again, you can't quite see these different competency areas, but these are the domains that this tool looks at, and these are the particular areas. Now, the report that you get, again, you get a dashboard as an individual. That, again, this is difficult to see, so just take the overall concepts here. I'm up to slide 19. There's an education and work profile, a competency mapping profile, competency assessment, and assessment reports. And in the report that you get a spiderweb diagram that shows your strengths and weaknesses across the 5 domains of technical interest. And those, the more color, the better you do. So the less color is the weaker area. Then in terms of the global sample, you'll see by these bars that there is a global bar and there's an individual bar. Again, you can't see this very clearly, but in the Dropbox that I'm providing you, there is an example report from our cohort that you can see exactly what this looks like. And it's very visual and it gives quite a clear indication of the strengths and weaknesses on the competency areas, and also how the education and work profile of that individual compares with the cohort, if that's what you want to do, but also with the international average, and that international average is determined by all the people that have taken the test. And so you need to keep that in mind. The second of these more employee proficiency test approaches I want to just draw your attention to is Unicef recently released a training needs analysis toolkit for immunization supply chain managers. And although the particular toolkit is very focused on immunization supply chain managers, a lot of the material is extremely adaptable to other contexts like health supply chain management, laboratory, other pharmaceutical management. There are 5 modules, and I've given in the box, drop box, you have access to these modules to have a read through. Basically, the first module gives you a more detailed background, like the webinar I'm giving you now, to give you an understanding, an overview of competency gap analysis and how that works. And the second module describes employee self-assessment and proficiency testing, which we've done, but goes into a lot more detail than I've done today. The module 3 gives you a detailed outline of a supply chain management training strategy. So what I'm going to talk about when I give you a bit more detail about our case study in Nigeria is how we use that data. And we use that data in 2 ways. You can use competency gap analysis data for individuals in order to prepare competency development plans for individuals, or competency development plans for a cohort. Or you can use it for a whole of organizational planning for education interventions. And that's what this module is talking about here, module 3. It gives a generic outline of a supply chain management training strategy for countries that you can populate based on the data from your gap assessment. And they've gone one step further and actually given you an option to be able to cost out that training plan based on some quite direct mathematics about the costs of different activities. But often we don't think about the cost, and that's quite an extra addition to the thinking, is to think about the cost. And then they've also got a 5th module which has a range of templates for training, implementation, curricula, and evaluation. I would note that for those of you who've been on my previous webinars, that we have a repository of curricula and a repository of training approaches from a range of countries that we've been developing that you all have access to, that I've been sharing from time to time. And this is a Unicef take on that. So I haven't listed this as a specific either employee proficiency test or an employee self-assessment, but it's more a 5-point module series that gives you more detailed information of doing gap analysis and gives you some further templates that you can apply in your particular context, noting that the focus is on immunization, but it is directly transferable. At this stage, I would like to again stop and invite those who have computer access to type in questions. And those on the call, if you have a particular question or point for clarification, the line is open to you, and I would invite you to come online and to state your question briefly. We'll take a few moments. Don't forget, those on the call, you may have muted yourself, but if you have any particular questions. I had a couple of questions about wanting these tools in French. And again, we haven't used this in any of our French-speaking countries, so we've not got any PSM tools, but I do note that the people that deliver have the competency framework in French, and you could copy and paste from that using the templates that we've been using already in PSM, if that helps. Yeah, so thank you, Florence, for your comments, just while we're waiting in case anyone else has a comment to make. Using the self-assessment approach is assuming that the individuals recognize their needs. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So they may have an idea of what they think is good practice, and they may rate themselves highly when in fact they may be a low practice. But they don't know any different. So that's one of the things to watch out for. In addition to having the competency of self-reflection, they need to be able to know what good looks like. The competency statements generally indicate that. Emmanuel, you're a step ahead, you good man. You've mentioned, can you align this with performance reviews? You can, and it's a tool that you can use for that sort of purpose. Because it helps with the competency development, but sometimes performance reviews have other purposes, and so if your purposes align, then certainly that's something you could do. In the remaining 15 minutes or so, I want to now move on to a couple of case studies so that you can understand how we have applied this. So the first country case study I'd like to draw to is Nigeria. And in this activity, we wanted to improve the competence of some selected PSM staff. This was 20 field advisors in supply chain management. And we wanted to use competency assessment tools. And with that data, we wanted to work with staff to create individual plans, but also a cohort plan. What were we going to do to improve competence? What we did in this case is we actually used all three tools. We used the Pamela Steele tool, we used the Empower tool, and we used a GHSC-PSM approach that actually was a self-reflection tool based on their job description. Now, this table just points out the similarities and differences of the tool. So the Pamela Steele is all technical and managerial competencies, but at a mid-level manager, so not entry level. Empower did all supply chain management technical competencies at both an entry and mid-level. And the PSM tool, because we chose the job description, this looked at specific technical and managerial competencies relating to the job description. So the point to make here is that existing market tools cover everything, and so they're a bit longer to fill in. But using job descriptions and thinking about things in your context, you can make things more specific. It depends on your purpose. Pamela Steele, Empower, all online. Pamela Steele gives you a global comparison, so does Empower. With the local tool, of course, we could just give comparison against the cohort. Now, I mentioned in Angola, we used a paper-based tool. For the Nigeria activity, we used Google Forms as a simple way of making this work, and that was very efficient for us. So what did we find? So again, this is a bit small, so I'm just going to read you a couple of highlights and then suggest you have a little read, and I'm also providing you a more detailed report so you can do further reading after. So basically, overall, the participants felt that they were able to undertake most parts of their job description with a high degree of confidence. So using our PSM method, there was only a couple of weaknesses, and this was around some of the more pharmaceutical specific competencies to do with waste disposal and to do with pharmacovigilance. The leaders and managers, the combined scores of the groups put them at around about or just below the global average. There was a few candidates who shone as stars and could be used as master trainers or mentors for others. So one of the advantages of comparing a cohort is you can see some high flyers or some star people who you can use to help other people. And the scores from the self-assessment showed there was a moderate to high development need across domains. And again, so compared to the average, these are just general comments, and I'll show you a more specific table later. Now, from Empower, the cohort had an overall good working experience and also performed well in storage and distribution and rational use of drugs. Keeping in mind, most of these people were also pharmacists. The cohort was relatively young in work experience and limited training, and they rated themselves weak in a number of general technical areas in supply chain management. And so when we looked at a cross-section across this, we just someone's come online, and we'll see if we can find them quickly to mute them. And what we discovered when we really drilled down to a couple of words was that in the selecting, basically forecasting was very poor, but it was not directly part of the job description, but it was necessary for them to understand it. So the tool from Empower and Pamela showed a great weakness in forecasting, but this was not a direct part of this particular job description. Or they mainly were responsible for the facilitation of data for people up the chain to do the forecasting. Procurement, again, was not relevant here. And in storing, the supplying, transporting, and disposing came up. The Empower tool also came up with disposal, and I mentioned that ours does as well, but I forgot to put that here. In using medicines, there was understanding, reporting use, and adverse drug reaction reporting as being issues. Now, this table is an oversimplification. The reports are in a lot more detail, but I made this table so that you could see that there are some similarities between the tools. So people ask me about the advantages of one tool versus another. What I've tried to do in this talk is give you some ideas of what some of the tools do and what some of the tools don't do in order to decide for yourself how you want to use them. I've found that each of the tools do what they say they're going to do. In other words, I would encourage you to read the details around the Pamela Steele tool and the Empower tool. Now, in terms of the management domains, it revealed the Pamela Steele tool, which has a lot of consideration to management, identified a whole range of weak issues to do with managing resources and professional management. Now, the Empower tool doesn't look at that, so you'd expect there to be a gap, but it did note that technology and data analysis was a weak area, and then assessing supply chain management activities, supportive supervision, and commodity loss were particular weaknesses. So one strong advantage of the Pamela Steele tool is in this is managing and professional and personal domains. So what this next slide does, which is slide 27, it summarizes what we did. So for cohort actions, we've basically taken the opportunity to refer individuals to a range of open access online resources where they can revise their background knowledge in regards to skills and knowledge. We identified more experienced field advisors, and we're going to use them as mentors to assist weaker staff. And in the process of developing a focused in-service training program that seeks to improve the particular weaker supply chain competency areas under the technical and managerial domains that were identified. And we're also considering how we might use an inspirational supply chain leadership for change management course to really grow their overall management and leadership competencies. The individual actions is to develop staff development plans to put into practice over the next 12 months. Now, we've given the staff templates to do this and a bunch of tools and resources, and I've also shared those. They'll be in the Dropbox for you to have a look at as well. Now, in short, the reason it's important for individuals to develop their own plans is an individual will have two aims. One is to be able to do good in their work currently, but also to prepare themselves for their own professional and personal future. In a work environment, when you're thinking about cohorts, the employer is interested in developing competencies that are going to improve the performance on the job and also improve performance to maintain retention and maybe be involved in succession planning. So the particular point here is to note that individual staff development plans should be owned and run by individuals, certainly in discussion with supervisors where that's available, because there are different purposes. So I just want to emphasize that point with this slide. The next two case studies are a little bit lighter, and I want to mention a couple of points about those before we hand back for more questions. In Angola, the particular aim was to use the self-reflection tool to determine the current level of competence across a range of employees responsible for supply chain management. The reason was to generate data for advocacy so that they create data to show the competency gap so they could advocate for the government for more resources, both in prioritization and money to take actions. So what happened? So there was a self-assessment of 20 key personnel. They were senior Ministry of Health and Logistics personnel and provincial coordinators. And they used the full paper-based 4-point Likert scale self-assessment, of which there's a copy in the box. They did this while all people were present at a workshop. So they gave an initial seminar on the competencies of self-reflection, explained very clearly the purpose of the self-assessment and how the data would be used and protected. The reason that's important is some people think you're going to use the data to sack them or put them out of their job because you're going to identify weakness. This was something that came up in the Angola situation. case study, but also it came up in the Nigeria case study. So it's very important to manage expectation, explain clearly how you will use the data generated, how you will keep the de-identified data organized, but also balance working with individuals. The result was that the evidence that was produced using this simple approach provided enough gap analysis evidence such that the Ministry of Health has now asked the National School of Public Health to prioritise the development of supply chain management postgraduate specialisation, master's degree from an English perspective. So this is an example of where we've used data from a gap analysis to instigate change. So that's an interesting case study. The next case study is in Malawi. Now, in this example, we wanted to use a self-reflection tool to determine the current level of competence of employees at a supply chain management at the facility level, because we wanted data in order to provide supportive supervision interventions. So in the Malawi context, we used a self-reflection tool, which I showed you earlier, on 25 behaviours that people looking after medicines in facilities should be able to do. They were asked to self-reflect. Now, this was done on a standard monitoring visit by the monitoring teams going facilities. That data was then brought back and given to district supply chain supervisors who analysed the data and given the limited budgets they had for supportive supervision, were able to do two things. One was to prioritise which facilities were the weakest and so needed to go there first. And second, they could prepare themselves for the supervisory visit by noting which particular competency areas they wanted the participant identified as weak, so they could go prepared for the supervisory visit to address those competencies. Now, what's interesting in the Malawi example is, in addition to the self-assessment tool, those district pharmacists had access to the broader monitoring data of stock availability, quality of the storage, and their other indicators. And so they use the competency assessment data with the monitoring data to prioritize facilities and then also to prioritize interventions. And that's also a very interesting approach for this particular data. So they're the three particular case studies I wanted to draw your attention to. If you have questions, then please type those in. I just want to draw your attention to the final couple of slides, which indicates the resources as we close. So if you're going to do this in your country, what should you do? So my suggestion to you is to think about what is the gap that you expect exists. In other words, which cadres are you focusing on, which facilities, what are the competencies you wish to assess? And then as you think about that, which I would describe as the scope of your assessment, you can then decide which of the assessment methods that we've discussed, or others, there are others available on the internet, in order to address your situation. And then particularly emphasize how will you orientate participants to the concepts of self-reflection. In the Nigeria case study, I used a webinar to link up people. So I'm from head office, and I linked up people from the different states, and we were able to have a good webinar where I presented this, and we had a discussion as to what was happening, how the data would be used, etc., just as an example. Now, in terms of the tools you have available to you, there is a range of tools at this location. Now, I'm going to be in trouble off Bridget because I've used Dropbox again because I'm having trouble organizing something else. So Bridget, I'll have to send you something special, which to share with the USAID colleagues, because at headquarters, we're still in the process of organizing our bigger SharePoint. But basically, in the tools we have available for people are the PSM tools we use in Angola, Malawi, and Nigeria, so you can see exactly the tools used. We've got an overview of the supply chain management competency assessment tools the approaches and the example cohort reports from those two tools. There's no example reports from Unicef, but their modules are there to review. And also the more detailed reports from the Nigeria case study, because that case study is a lot more detailed than the other three. There's a slide here about developing individual staff plans, and particularly here it's about educating people to identify their gaps, identifying education opportunities, and in this Dropbox is also a 2-page document on all available, a range of available free resources that people can use to develop competency and fill competency gaps, and we encourage staff with the development plan to review it every 6 months and with your supervisor if you can. Now, we should all be doing this as part of our lifelong journey as professionals, whether we're supply chain professionals or public health officials or professionals. Please, I now want to open up to particular questions you might have from across this. What I've tried to do today is a couple of things. What I've tried to do is to give you an overview of a competency-based approach that we use for gap analysis, understanding some of the elements of professional reflection that are required, as well as planned professional development, give you an overview of a range of tools that are available, give you some case studies, and then highlight the resources that we've been collecting and we have available for you. At the end of the slide deck, there is also 3 other slides you might find helpful. One is a reminder about IAPHL as a great place to be involved in conversation around supply chain and skill development, and a couple of slides with links to resources which duplicate what's in the box. So with that, please, if you're on the call, the line's open for you to verbally, if you're on the phone, give us your question. If you're on the computer, please type in your questions, and I'll answer those over the next few minutes for those who can stick around. But for those of you who have to go, I want to thank you so much for participating on the call, and I've hoped that you found this helpful, and I would encourage you to reach out to me directly to discuss your country-specific circumstances. Yeah, so Florence's question is quite a good one, and basically, can the assessment tools differentiate challenges related to skill gaps? For example, perhaps some of those skill gaps could be due to lack of staff, low salary, lack of equipment, etc. So the way that the assessment tools are designed is to assess an individual's behavior, what they can and can't do. And the way it's worded is on the basis of their knowledge and their abilities. But it is possible that a negative answer could have another reason. So, for example, maybe some funding is limited or a lack of equipment. So it is possible that a negative answer could be for a different reason apart from a lack of understanding. So thank you for that question. If you've on the call and you've been using some sort of self-assessment or other approach for competency gap analysis, please also type in what you've been doing as well. Bridget, as the technical backstop for workforce development, do you have any particular questions or points you'd like to raise on this issue? I know Bridget had another call, so she may have already moved on. We still have a couple of minutes, so if you do have a further question or clarification you'd like to make, then I would invite you to put that in the chat. Thanks for your comments. The other, for those still waiting, if you have a question, then please answer. I'm sticking around for a couple of minutes. I do have another call to go on, but I'll stay for 5 minutes before going on to my other call. I'm about to, in the next couple of weeks, or I'm going to send out an email to everyone to ask you what type of webinars you would like me to conduct, to ask you what your topics that you would like to have. And I'm going to try and do a webinar every 2 months to make this a regular feature, because I've had some good feedback that people enjoy my webinars. So watch out for that email. But while we still have a couple of minutes, if you have any further questions,